The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal floors, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into artificial stars that mimicked the home systems of 1,000 different species. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood at the human podium, her modest gray suit a stark contrast to the elaborate ceremonial garments worn by representatives from across the galaxy. The Zephyrian delegate's crystalline skin caught the light in rainbow patterns, while the massive Kraxon ambassador's 4 arms gestured dramatically as he spoke in subsonic rumbles that shook the floor. Sarah waited patiently as the translation matrix processed the complaints being hurled at humanity from every corner of the vast chamber. The accusations were the same ones that had been echoing through these halls for the past 50 years. Ever since Earth had been granted membership in this ancient institution that governed trade, territorial disputes, and interstellar law across 90% of the known galaxy. The humans refused to comply with Standard Resource Distribution Protocol 77 Alpha, boomed the Kraxon representative, his voice causing several smaller species to retreat behind their protective barriers. They continue to hoard their technological innovations rather than sharing them freely with the galactic community as required by the Collective Advancement Doctrine. A chorus of agreement arose from dozens of species. The insectoid hive queen of the Zentari clicked her mandibles in rapid succession, which the translation matrix rendered as sharp, accusatory statements. Humanity has developed faster-than-light communication arrays that surpass our quantum entanglement networks by orders of magnitude. Yet they claim these innovations are proprietary and refuse to transfer the technology to the Council's research division. Sarah's jaw tightened as she listened to the familiar litany of demands. For half a century, humanity had been expected to hand over every breakthrough, every innovation, every hard-won advancement to be distributed freely among species that had been spacefaring for millennia while humans were still learning to make fire. The Galactic Council's philosophy was simple. All knowledge belonged to all species, and no single civilization should advance faster than the collective whole. But humanity had never been good at following that particular rule. The human species continues to demonstrate the same reckless individualism that characterized their primitive pre-contact society, declared the ethereal luminary representative, her form shifting between states of matter as she spoke. Their refusal to embrace collective consciousness protocols has led to dangerous innovations in artificial intelligence, quantum manipulation, and biological enhancement. These developments threaten the stability of the galactic order. Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber despite her lack of any technological amplification. Honored delegates, humanity has contributed more technological advancement to the galactic community in the past 50 years than most civilizations achieve in 1,000. Our medical breakthroughs have eliminated 17 major diseases that plagued Council species. Our agricultural innovations have ended famine on 43 worlds. Our engineering solutions have prevented the collapse of 6 star systems. All of which could have been achieved faster and more efficiently through proper collective research protocols, interrupted the Vorthak Prime Minister, his tentacles writhing with indignation. Instead, human stubbornness has delayed these advances by decades, while your species insisted on pursuing individual credit and economic compensation. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Humanity had indeed insisted on maintaining intellectual property rights, patent systems, and individual recognition for innovations. They had refused to dissolve their national governments into a single planetary collective. They had resisted the neural linking technologies that would have connected human consciousness to the galactic mind web. In every way that mattered to the Council, humans had remained frustratingly, aggressively individual. Furthermore, continued the Vorthak representative, humanity's military expansion violates the peaceful coexistence accords. Your species has constructed 17 new starship classes in the past decade, each more heavily armed than the last. Your exploration fleets carry enough firepower to sterilize entire systems. This aggressive militarization threatens the peace we have maintained for over 2,000 years. Sarah smiled grimly at that accusation. The Council's definition of peace was simple: maintain the status quo at all costs. The same species that had ruled the galaxy for millennia would continue to rule it, while younger civilizations like humanity were expected to know their place and follow established protocols. Innovation was discouraged unless it came from the proper channels. Expansion was forbidden unless it benefited the collective. Independence was seen as a dangerous aberration that threatened galactic stability. The human delegation will respond to these concerns, Sarah announced, her voice carrying a note of finality that caused several alien ambassadors to shift nervously. They had heard that tone before, usually just before humanity did something that scandalized the entire galactic community. She activated a small device on her podium, and holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber. The images showed star charts, technical schematics, and most shocking of all, military deployment patterns that extended far beyond Earth's official territorial claims. For 50 years, humanity has attempted to work within the framework of the Galactic Council, Sarah began, her words measured and deliberate. We have shared our innovations, contributed to collective research projects, and abided by territorial restrictions that limit our expansion to a handful of systems despite our rapidly growing population. We have done this because we believed in the Council's stated mission of peaceful cooperation and mutual advancement. She paused, letting the holographic displays cycle through images of human colonies, research stations, and starship construction facilities scattered across dozens of previously unknown systems. However, recent intelligence has revealed that the Council's true purpose is not cooperation, but control. Our deep space monitoring networks have detected secret communications between Council leadership and the hegemony of ancient worlds. These communications reveal a conspiracy to limit humanity's technological advancement, restrict our territorial expansion, and ultimately reduce our species to a client state dependent on Council-controlled resources. The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates from a dozen species began speaking simultaneously, their translation matrices creating a cacophony of denials, accusations, and demands for evidence. The Kraxon ambassador's subsonic roars shook dust from the crystal ceiling, while the Zentari hive queen's chittering rose to painful frequencies. Sarah waited for the noise to subside before continuing. The evidence is irrefutable. The Council has been deliberately sabotaging human research projects, manipulating trade agreements to our disadvantage, and coordinating with hostile species to contain our expansion. The recent attack on our colony at Ross 128 was not carried out by pirates, as the Council claimed, but by hegemony strike forces using Council intelligence. The Luminari representative's form flickered with what the translation matrix identified as extreme agitation. These accusations are baseless. The Council exists to maintain peace and order. Your species' paranoid tendencies are well documented. Our paranoid tendencies have kept us alive, Sarah replied calmly. While the Council preached cooperation, we prepared for the inevitable betrayal. While you demanded that we share our innovations, we developed technologies you cannot imagine. While you restricted our expansion, we established colonies in systems your surveys missed. She gestured to the holographic displays, which now showed the true extent of human expansion. Secret colonies dotted the galactic rim, hidden research facilities operated in the void between stars, and massive industrial complexes churned out technologies that surpassed anything in the Council's databases. Humanity withdraws from the Galactic Council effective immediately, Sarah announced. "We renounce all treaties, trade agreements, and territorial restrictions imposed by this body. Earth and all human colonies are hereby declaring independence from galactic authority." The silence that followed was absolute. In the 2,000-year history of the Galactic Council, no species had ever voluntarily withdrawn from membership. The very concept was so alien that several translation matrices simply shut down, unable to process the implications. The Vorthak Prime Minister was the first to recover. "This is impossible. No civilization can survive outside the galactic community. You will have no trade partners, no territorial protection, no access to the quantum communication networks that bind civilized space together." Sarah's smile was predatory. "We've been preparing for this moment since the day we joined the Council. Human colonies are already self-sufficient. Our trade networks bypass Council-controlled routes entirely, and our communication systems operate on principles you haven't discovered yet." She activated another sequence on her control device, and the chamber's main display screen flickered to life. It showed real-time images from across human space. Massive orbital shipyards constructing vessels of unprecedented size and capability. Research stations experimenting with technologies that defied galactic scientific understanding, and most shocking of all, entire star systems that had been transformed into fortress worlds bristling with weapons that made Council naval forces look like children's toys. "For 50 years you've demanded that humanity conform to galactic standards," Sarah continued. "You've insisted that we suppress our competitive instincts, abandon our individual achievements, and accept limitations on our growth and development. You've treated us like unruly children who needed to be civilized and controlled." She began walking toward the chamber's exit, her footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. "But you forgot one important fact about humanity. We've never been good at accepting limitations. Every barrier you've placed in our path has only made us more determined to find a way around it. Every restriction you've imposed has driven us to develop capabilities you never imagined. Every attempt to control us has strengthened our resolve to be free." The massive doors of the chamber began to slide open as Sarah approached them. "The age of Council dominance is ending. Humanity will chart its own course among the stars, and any species that stands in our way will discover why our ancestors conquered an entire planet while you were still debating resource allocation protocols in committee meetings." As the human ambassador disappeared through the doorway, the assembled delegates sat in shocked silence. The implications of humanity's withdrawal were staggering. Without human technological contributions, dozens of ongoing research projects would collapse. Trade routes that had become dependent on human-manufactured goods would face critical shortages. Most terrifying of all, the military balance that had kept the galaxy peaceful for millennia had just shifted in ways that no one could predict. The Kraxan ambassador was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "What have we done?" But it was already too late for regrets. Across the galaxy, human ships were moving into position for operations that would reshape the balance of power forever. The Council had spent 50 years trying to tame humanity's wild nature, never realizing that they were not dealing with just another spacefaring species, but with the inheritors of a world where only the strongest, smartest, and most adaptable survived. The universe was about to learn a lesson that Earth's history had taught countless times. Never underestimate the species that evolved by refusing to accept defeat. Admiral Marcus Steele stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching through reinforced viewports as the massive hegemony battle fleet approached the Kepler 442 system. The enemy formation stretched across thousands of kilometers of space, their bioluminescent hull markings creating patterns of light that had intimidated countless civilizations into surrender over the past 3 millennia. 17 different species had contributed ships to this punitive expedition, united in their determination to crush humanity's rebellion before it could inspire others to follow suit. 2,347 capital ships, reported Commander Elena Vasquez from her position at the tactical station. Destroyer and cruiser escorts bring the total to just over 8,000 vessels. They're broadcasting surrender demands on all frequencies. Marcus nodded calmly, his weathered face showing no trace of concern, despite being outnumbered nearly 40-1. The human defensive fleet consisted of only 200 ships, most of them recently commissioned vessels whose capabilities were still theoretical. By every traditional measure of naval warfare, the battle was already over before it had begun. "Are the civilians evacuated from the outer colonies?" he asked. "Last transport cleared the system boundary 6 hours ago," confirmed Lieutenant Zhang from the communications console. "All non-essential personnel have been relocated to the secondary defensive line." Marcus smiled grimly. The hegemony expected humanity to follow standard defensive protocols, evacuate civilians, concentrate forces around inhabited worlds, and attempt to negotiate favorable surrender terms when the enemy's numerical superiority became overwhelming. They had used the same tactics to crush a dozen rebellions over the past 1,000 years, always achieving victory through sheer, overwhelming force. But humanity had spent 50 years studying those previous conflicts, analyzing every tactical decision, every strategic mistake that had led to defeat. They had learned that conventional warfare against the established galactic powers was a losing proposition. The Council species had been perfecting their military doctrines for millennia, and their resource advantages were insurmountable through traditional means. So humanity had chosen a different path entirely. "Signal the fleet," Marcus ordered. "Execute Protocol Omega." Across the human battle line, ships that had appeared to be standard cruiser and destroyer designs began to transform. Hull plates retracted to reveal weapon systems that had never appeared in any galactic database. Power signatures spiked beyond what should have been possible for vessels of their size. Most shocking of all, several ships seemed to simply vanish from sensor screens, their stealth systems employing principles that violated the Council's understanding of physics. The Hegemony Fleet Commander, an ancient Etherian known as Void Singer Cthulhu, had been expecting a brief skirmish followed by humanity's inevitable surrender. His species had been dominant in space warfare since before Earth had developed written language, and he had personally commanded the fleets that crushed the Nexari Rebellion, the Drift War, and the systematic extermination of the Forgotten Worlds. In his 3,000-year career, he had never encountered a force that could seriously threaten hegemony supremacy. That confidence lasted exactly 14 seconds after the human fleet opened fire. The first salvo came from weapons that shouldn't have existed. Instead of the plasma cannons and particle beams favored by Council militaries, the human ships launched projectiles that tore through space at significant fractions of light speed. These kinetic rounds ignored energy shields, passed through defensive fields, and struck with the force of small asteroids. A single hit was enough to cripple a capital ship, and the humans were firing hundreds of rounds per second. But the kinetic weapons were just the opening act. As hegemony ships began to respond to this unprecedented assault, they discovered that their targeting systems couldn't lock onto half the human fleet. The vessels that had vanished from sensors were still there, still firing, but somehow invisible to every detection method the galactic powers had developed over millions of years of warfare. Void Singer Cthulhu watched in growing horror as his carefully ordered battle line began to collapse under the human assault. Ships that had dominated space lanes for centuries were being reduced to drifting wreckage by weapons that defied galactic understanding. His own flagship, a massive biomechanical construct grown over the course of 50 years, shuddered under impacts that somehow bypassed its organic armor plating. "Return fire!" he commanded, his psychic voice echoing through the consciousness of every Etherian in the fleet. "Concentrate all weapons on the human command ship." The response was devastating. 2,000 capital ships unleashed their full firepower in a coordinated barrage that should have vaporized anything within 1,000 kilometers of its center. The space around the UES Defiance became a hellscape of intersecting energy beams, plasma torrents, and exotic matter streams. Sensor screens whited out from the sheer intensity of the attack. When the energy discharges finally faded, Admiral Steele's flagship remained exactly where it had been, its hull unmarked by the incredible assault it had just survived. The secret lay in humanity's greatest breakthrough during their years of secret research. They had learned to manipulate space-time itself on a tactical level. The Defiance hadn't survived the attack by absorbing or deflecting it, but by creating a localized distortion that caused the incoming fire to curve around the ship and strike empty space. "Target their command vessels," Marcus ordered calmly. "Let's show them what human engineering can accomplish when we're not bound by Council restrictions." The human counterattack introduced the galaxy to weapons that would haunt alien nightmares for generations to come. Singularity torpedoes created micro-black holes that consumed entire ships before evaporating in bursts of Hawking radiation. Temporal displacement cannons aged target vessels by centuries in seconds, reducing mighty warships to rusted hulks that crumbled apart under their own weight. Most terrifying of all were the probability disruptors, which somehow caused enemy weapons to malfunction, navigation systems to fail, and hull breaches to appear in impossible locations. The hegemony fleet, which had entered the system expecting an easy victory, found itself fighting for survival against an enemy that seemed to possess godlike powers. Ships that had never known defeat were being systematically destroyed by weapons that violated every known law of physics. Defensive systems that had protected fleets for millennia proved utterly useless against human innovation. Within 2 hours, the greatest military armada ever assembled in galactic history was in full retreat. Those ships that could still maneuver fled toward the system's edge, while others drifted helplessly with their crews desperately broadcasting surrender signals. The human fleet pursued relentlessly, demonstrating that their advantages weren't limited to defensive warfare. "Sir," Commander Vasquez reported, her voice tight with amazement, "we're receiving priority transmissions from across the galaxy. The Zephyrian Confederacy is requesting immediate diplomatic contact. The Nixari remnant wants to discuss an alliance. Even the Drift Lords are asking for safe passage through human space." Marcus wasn't surprised. News of the battle would spread through the galactic communication networks within hours, and every species would be forced to recalculate their position in the new order. Humanity had just demonstrated that the old rules no longer applied, that technological superiority could overcome any numerical disadvantage, and that the supposedly invincible hegemony could be defeated by a species that had been spacefaring for less than a century. But the real shockwaves were just beginning. As reports of humanity's victory reached the core worlds, panic began to spread through the established order. If humans could defeat the hegemony's premier battle fleet, what else were they capable of? How many other secret weapons did they possess? How long had they been preparing for this moment? The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions on every member world. Trade routes that had operated for millennia were suddenly questioned as potential security risks. Military budgets that had remained stable for centuries were tripled overnight. Species that had been content to exist under Council protection suddenly began developing their own independent defense capabilities. Most significantly, the rigid technological sharing protocols that had defined galactic civilization for 2,000 years began to crumble. If humanity could advance so far beyond galactic norms through independent research, other species began to wonder what they might accomplish if freed from Council restrictions. Secret research projects began appearing across the galaxy as civilizations that had been stagnating for millennia suddenly remembered the thrill of innovation and discovery. The Zentari Hive Queen, whose species had perfected biological engineering before Earth's sun had finished forming, announced that her colonies would begin developing new adaptations without Council oversight. The crystalline entities of the Resonance Collective, masters of quantum manipulation, declared their intention to pursue research directions that had been forbidden for eons. Even the ancient builders, who had constructed the galactic transportation network in the distant past, began to emerge from their long isolation to reclaim technologies they had abandoned in the name of stability. On Earth, President Sarah Martinez addressed the world from the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. The same woman who had served as humanity's ambassador to the Galactic Council now held the highest office on the planet, elected on a platform of human independence and self-determination. "Fellow humans," she began, her image broadcast to every corner of human space, "today marks the end of 50 years of subjugation and the beginning of our true expansion among the stars. We have proven that human ingenuity, determination, and refusal to accept limitations can overcome any obstacle. The galaxy no longer sees us as junior members of an ancient club, but as the inheritors of the future." She paused as images of the battle played behind her, showing human ships performing impossible maneuvers and wielding weapons that seemed to bend reality itself. "But our victory is not complete. The forces that sought to control us still exist, and they will not accept this defeat quietly. Other species watch our success and wonder if they too might break free from the restrictions that have held them back for millennia. The galaxy stands at a crossroads, and humanity must choose whether we will become the new masters or the liberators of countless civilizations that yearn for freedom." As her words echoed across human space, construction began on new shipyards, research facilities, and colonial installations. The technologies that had won the battle at Kepler 442 were already being improved upon, refined, and adapted for purposes that would have been unimaginable just months before. Humanity was no longer content to simply defend their independence. They were preparing to reshape the galaxy according to their own vision. The universe had been turned upside down in the span of a few hours, and the tremors of change were only beginning to spread across the stars. 5 years had passed since humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council, and the universe bore little resemblance to the ordered civilization that had existed for 2 millennia. Dr. Kenji Nakamura stood in the observation dome of Prometheus Station, watching as the latest batch of liberation fleets prepared for departure. The massive orbital complex, built in the void between stars where no council sensors could detect it, had become the nerve center of what galactic media had dubbed the human cascade, a wave of technological and political revolution sweeping across known space. "The Vorthon Republic's delegation has arrived," announced his assistant, Dr. Lisa Park, as she entered the dome carrying a datapad filled with requests for assistance. "They're requesting full technological packages for independence just like the Nexari and the Drift collectives before them." Kenji smiled as he watched another species' representatives board human transport ships that would carry them to secret research facilities. The Vorthons had been among the most vocal supporters of council authority just 5 years ago. Their tentacled forms a common sight in the assembly halls where they had regularly denounced human recklessness and dangerous individualism. Now they were begging for the same technologies that would free them from dependence on their former masters. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Within months of humanity's military victory over the hegemony, cracks had begun to appear in the galactic order that had seemed so permanent. Species that had been client states for millennia suddenly questioned why they needed council approval for basic research projects. Civilizations that had accepted technological stagnation as the price of peace began to remember the dreams and ambitions their ancestors had abandoned in the name of stability. The breaking point had come when the Council attempted to punish species that had expressed support for human independence. Economic sanctions, territorial restrictions, and technology embargoes that had been used for centuries to maintain discipline suddenly proved toothless when humanity offered alternatives. Human trade networks bypassed Council-controlled routes entirely. Human military forces provided protection that surpassed anything the galactic authorities could offer, and human research facilities welcomed scientists from across the galaxy who had been stifled by collective oversight protocols. "How many liberation requests are we processing this cycle?" Kenji asked as he reviewed the latest reports from across human space. 43 formal applications for full independence packages, Lisa replied, consulting her datapad. Another 67 requests for partial technological assistance and over 200 informal contacts from species that are testing the waters. The builders have agreed to provide us with complete schematics for the Galactic Transportation Network in exchange for our dimensional manipulation technologies. Kenji nodded with satisfaction. The builders' offer was particularly significant because their ancient race had constructed the infrastructure that bound galactic civilization together. Their willingness to share those secrets with humanity represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Soon, human space would have its own transportation hubs, completely independent of Council oversight. But the most remarkable development was taking place on thousands of worlds where species that had been dormant for centuries were suddenly exploding with innovation. The Zentari, no longer bound by restrictions on biological experimentation, had created new adaptations that allowed their colonies to thrive in previously uninhabitable environments. The Resonance Collective had developed quantum technologies that made galactic communication networks look primitive. The Nexari had begun constructing megastructures that dwarfed anything the Council had ever attempted. "Sir," interrupted Commander Torres from the communication station, "we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. President Martinez wants to speak with you directly." Kenji activated the holographic projector, and Sarah Martinez's image materialized in the center of the observation dome. The years of leadership had aged her, but her eyes still burned with the same determination that had carried humanity through its declaration of independence. "Kenji," she began without preamble, "the Council is planning something desperate. Our intelligence networks have detected massive military buildups in the core systems. They're calling it Operation Final Authority, an attempt to restore galactic order through overwhelming force." The scientist wasn't surprised by the news. The Council's position had become increasingly untenable as more species broke free from their control. The economic foundations of their civilization were crumbling as trade routes switched to human-controlled networks. Their technological advantages were evaporating as former client species gained access to innovations that surpassed anything in Council databases. Most critically, their moral authority had collapsed as the galaxy discovered the surveillance networks, mind control experiments, and social engineering programs that had kept the old order stable for so long. "What's the scope of this operation?" Kenji asked. "They're mobilizing everything," Sarah replied grimly. "Every remaining loyal fleet, every secret weapon they've developed over the past millennia, every ally they can coerce or bribe into supporting them. Intelligence estimates suggest they'll field over 50,000 capital ships within the next 6 months. The number was staggering, representing the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. Even with their technological advantages, humanity's fleets numbered only in the hundreds of vessels. The species they had liberated were still in the early stages of building their own defense capabilities. On paper, the Council's final gambit looked like certain victory. But Kenji knew that the equations of power had fundamentally changed since humanity's emergence as an independent force. The galaxy was no longer the same place where overwhelming numerical superiority guaranteed success. "Have you informed our allies?" he asked. "Transmissions are already going out through the secure networks," Sarah confirmed. "But Kenji, we need to be prepared for the possibility that this time numbers might actually matter. Even with our technological advantages, there are limits to what we can accomplish against such overwhelming force." Kenji turned back to the observation ports, where the latest Liberation fleet was beginning to move toward the dimensional gates that would carry them to distant corners of the galaxy. Each ship carried not just weapons and supplies, but also the promise of freedom for species that had never dared to dream of independence. "Then we'll have to make sure the galaxy understands what's at stake," he said finally. "This isn't just about humanity anymore. It's about whether the universe will be ruled by ancient powers who fear change or by the countless civilizations that are just beginning to discover their potential." Within hours of the intelligence report, the secure networks that connected humanity's allies began to hum with activity. The liberation movement that had started with Earth's dramatic withdrawal from the Council had grown into something far larger and more powerful than anyone had imagined. Species across the galaxy began to mobilize not just to defend their newfound independence, but to ensure that the old system of control could never be restored. The Nexari, who had spent the past 5 years developing their industrial capabilities with human assistance, began converting their megastructures into massive shipyards. The builders emerged from their ancient strongholds carrying weapons that predated galactic civilization itself. The Zentari revealed that their biological experiments had produced warrior forms specifically designed for void combat. Hundreds of other species, from the crystalline entities of the Outer Rim to the energy beings of the galactic core, began to demonstrate capabilities that had been hidden or forgotten during the long centuries of Council dominance. Most significantly, the liberation movement had sparked an explosion of innovation that made the galaxy's technological stagnation seem like a distant nightmare. Species that had been forced to share all research through Council oversight were suddenly racing to develop new capabilities, each trying to outdo their neighbors in creativity and ingenuity. The competitive spirit that the Council had tried so hard to suppress was driving advances that surpassed millennia of collective research in just a few years. When the Council's final authority fleet finally moved toward human space 6 months later, they found themselves facing not just humanity's defenders, but an alliance of liberation forces that had been transformed by 5 years of unrestricted development. The ancient ships and time-tested tactics of the galactic establishment met weapons and strategies that had never been seen before, wielded by species that had rediscovered the fierce joy of independent achievement. The battle that followed lasted 3 days and reshaped the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. When it was over, the Galactic Council existed only as a historical curiosity, its member species having either joined the liberation movement or retreated to isolated systems where they could no longer threaten anyone's independence. The hegemony, which had dominated space warfare for millennia, was reduced to scattered remnants fleeing toward the galactic rim. In the aftermath, humanity found itself in a position they had never sought, but could not avoid. Across the galaxy, newly independent civilizations looked to Earth not as a new master, but as the species that had shown them the path to freedom. The technologies that humans had developed in secret were freely shared with anyone who wanted them, creating a cascade of advancement that promised to transform the universe in ways that no one could predict. Dr. Kenji Nakamura stood once again in the observation dome of Prometheus Station. But now he was watching something unprecedented in galactic history. Where once there had been the rigid order of the Council's civilization, there was now a vibrant chaos of independent species pursuing their own destinies among the stars. Trade routes shifted daily as new partnerships formed between civilizations that had never been permitted to interact directly. Research stations appeared in previously empty systems, as scientists from hundreds of worlds collaborated on projects that would have been forbidden just years before. The universe had become a very different place. Instead of the stagnant stability that had characterized galactic civilization for 2 millennia, there was now the dynamic uncertainty of a cosmos where anything was possible. Species that had been client states for countless generations were building their own empires, developing their own technologies, and pursuing their own visions of the future. Humanity had achieved something that no previous rebellion had even attempted. They had not simply overthrown the old order, but had inspired an entirely new way of thinking about galactic civilization. The idea that progress could be achieved through competition rather than collective oversight, that species could cooperate as equals rather than as masters and subjects, and that individual achievement could benefit everyone rather than threatening galactic stability, had spread like wildfire across the stars. Earth's departure from the Galactic Council had indeed sent shockwaves across the universe. But those shockwaves had not destroyed galactic civilization. They had transformed it into something far grander than anything the ancient powers had ever envisioned. The cosmos was no longer bound by the limitations of the past, but was racing toward a future where the only constant was change, and the only limit was imagination. As Kenji watched the latest wave of exploration fleets departing for unknown regions of space, he smiled at the thought of what humanity's children might discover in a universe finally free to reach its full potential. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the greatest act of creation began with the courage to walk away from everything you had known and forge your own path among the stars.